So there's this funny saying in Indian families, right? That you're either a doctor, an engineer, or a failure. Despite the fact that I was a classically trained Bharatanatyam dancer, I sang Carnatic music, which is South Indian classical music. I sang folk music, and I practiced many instruments. I thought maybe, doctor, engineer, or failure, I should probably pick another career choice. So when I came back to Miami, I did a degree in psychology, and my first job was at Everglades Correctional Institution, which is in Miami, which I was really excited for. I thought it was going to be great on my resume, and there's a picture of me sitting in front of my first job. It was a wonderful place. I learned a lot there. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I did know that I was going to coach inmates. Now, if you see the little highlighted line, that's the picture that you just saw. I was sitting right in front of that post. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and you'll see a huge building over there. That's where I met with the inmates twice a week, once a week, depending on what they needed. And we would talk about life and things. I'm going to zoom out a little bit more, and now you'll see the actual complex of where they lived. Now here's the little absurd thing about this, is that I was 19 when I got this job. Some of them had been inside the prison longer than I had been alive. So the fact that I was going to counsel these men who have obviously faced more hardships than I was a little ridiculous. But I did grow to love them, and they grew to love me. I think that it was a combination of a certain naivety that I had and them wanting to see a fresh face, but it really blossomed into a good friendship. Although I gotta say that they were really disconnected from the rest of the world. For example, they asked me what Facebook was because everyone was talking about Facebook, and I tried explaining it to them, and they thought, is it like the yellow pages with like faces on them? I said, no, it's this online site, and then they said, really? You want to put all of your personal information on an online site? Why? I'm telling you, 19-year-old me needed to hear that. And then the next sentence was, are you not capable of living in the actual moment? Like, do you have to document it? Which I think was a really sweet. I learned a lot with them. I also learned that there's a possibility that you can dehumanize someone. There's something called roll call that would happen every single time they said that they needed to roll call. The inmates would have to drop what they're doing, and they would have to stand in a formation, and everyone would have to make sure that everyone was there, so on and so forth, which is also, again, a little absurd because some of them haven't left in 20 years. So there was this huge disconnect between the world that I knew and the world that they knew. Yet, my job was to help them create something called a post-release plan. They didn't know if they were going to go home. They had been there for a long time, but in the small possibility that they were going to go home, it was my job to help them come back into the world. We would talk about stuff, about spirituality, what they were going to do with housing, long-term goals, short-term goals, what they would do for their leisure activities. I think one of the moments that I will always remember is when one of the inmates told me that all he wanted once he got out was to have one piece of fresh fruit, because he hadn't had fresh fruit in, again, longer than I've been alive. But then we started talking about creativity. I mean, mind you, this is me, the girl who ran away from a career in arts because I wasn't sure what exactly creativity was or how you can monetize it. And they asked me, is creativity for the privileged? Or they felt that creativity was for the privileged. Then they asked me what was creativity, and I had no idea. I don't know how many of the audience members can answer that question. One of them argued that it's for people who have luxury of time, luxury of money. I mean, how otherwise can you be creative? Someone else argued that creativity wasn't real and it was for the children of them hippies. But here's the funny thing though, that first quote that you see on the screen right now, that was by someone who had invented this tattoo gun, except with the limited resources that he had, so he was using a pen, and he got into a lot of trouble for it. But still, he managed to do it. And the second quote is from someone who told me this story about how his glasses were broken and they have only fixed resources. So what he did is he took the plastic glass, the edge of it, and started rubbing it against the gravel, and it melted, and he used that little bit of hot plastic to be able to hold his glass in place until he got another one. I think that we can argue that this is creative, but they didn't see it that way. They saw it as survival. So moving on, my first homework exercise that I gave them was in poetry, and I gave them that exercise right there. And essentially I said, I just want a poem. Write any poem, anything at all, because they were convinced that poetry and all this fluffery was not for men of this hard life. And writing a poem for them was good because they were part of this program that was going to supposedly help them go back home. So within seconds, I got this response. I really liked the lesson. I don't think that's the question. I was not bored. Now may I have my reward? And I thought that was brilliant. I mean, it's hilarious, it's brilliant, and it's straight to the point. Now here's a philosophical-looking person. Some of you may recognize him as Henry David Thoreau. And there's a quote that looks philosophical. I'm going to pick out certain words. Every day is a journey, and the journey itself is home. Now I'm betting if we saw this on the internet, on Facebook or something, we'd probably think, oh, this is really profound. What kind of intelligence must this philosopher have possessed? But this is actually straight from, this is a scanned copy of the actual homework assignment that I got from one of the inmates. He drew that and he wrote that verbatim. Yet he did not give himself the credit to think that this was worth something because, well, he had been taught to say, you're an inmate. But I was incredibly, incredibly touched by all of the poems. We got so many beautiful poems. I'm talking about almost 130. This is a particular anecdote of someone who fixed a soccer ball. So if you remember the picture that I showed you of how they were dressed, they have a pant and a shirt, and you're not really allowed to do anything with it because technically it doesn't belong to the inmates. They used the little bit of cloth that was here so that when they tucked it in, no one would be able to tell that that cloth was gone, and fixed a soccer ball with it. Another inmate told me about the story of how he used paper to create this sort of funnel system so that cold air would be funneled into what was otherwise an unbearably hot room. Yet they still claim that none of this was creative. This was just them trying to survive. They thought that creativity was this elusive, abstract concept reserved for people who had the resources to do so. The soccer ball, the funnel, the tattoo gun, none of this to them. None of this was creative, as much as I tried to argue otherwise. And then something interesting happened. I thought, all right, well, if you're not giving yourself the credit because of the context, how do we remove the context? So what I did is I collected all of their poetry, typed it up, put a pretty logo on it, called it Entrapped Words, and we made it a book of their poetry. And then I brought it back to them. And suddenly, because the context had changed, for the first time for some of them in decades, they had the opportunity to look at their work not in the context of I am an inmate, but in the context of I'm an author who contributed to a poetry book. I think that realization, in fact, working towards getting them to get to that realization, is in a way what made me realize that context is really sometimes how we define creativity. It wasn't until they saw this book that they gave themselves enough credit for what they were doing. I want to leave you with this. This is an image that one of the inmates drew for me. It ended up becoming the cover of the book. I look at it very often. I think it's beautiful. And every time I doubt myself, I look at this and I ask myself, am I just not giving myself enough credit? And I'd like for you to take the same from this story. I hope that you get as inspired from these men that I may or may never see for the rest of my life. And I hope that you get as inspired as I was by them. Thank you.